On an August morning at the Caldwell County Stockyard in western Kentucky, a 23-year-old woman named Della Fales bought 19 of the thinnest cows anyone in the county could remember seeing at auction. She paid $442 a head for them, $8,400 out of a checking account that had held $12,263 when the auctioneer had opened the morning session at 9. The 19 cows had been standing in the back pen, which was the pen the stockyard reserved for what the men in the ring called special situations, cows that were too old to breed, cows with old injuries, cows off ground that had run out of grass, cows nobody wanted for anything except the killer buyer, who priced them by the pound, dressed minus his haul. The killer buyer that morning was a man from Bowling Green named Marlin Pratt. Marlin Pratt had bid $430 a head on the whole lot. Della Fales had bid $442. Marlin Pratt had looked at her once from across the ring and had shaken his head and had let the lot go. That was how she got them. The men in the corridor did not shake their heads. They laughed. The loudest of them was a rancher named Buck Hollis. Buck Hollis was 58 years old. He wore a starched shirt with pearl snaps, a straw hat that had never been rained on, and boots that had cost more than the horse he had ridden in on when he was 20. He was standing outside the corridor rail with his sister's son, a 35-year-old named Bo Pratt, who was not related to Marlin Pratt, but who worked seasonally on Buck Hollis's operation and who thought of himself at all times as an authority on cattle. Buck Hollis said loud enough for Della to hear, "That's not cattle, honey. That's dog food." Bo Pratt lifted his phone. He took a photograph of Della standing at the back pen with the paperwork in her hand and the 19 thin cows behind her. He sent it to a group text of 6 of his friends. He wrote, "You will not believe what the Fales girl just did." Della did not answer either of them. She signed her paperwork. She loaded the cows onto 2 hired stock trailers. She drove home to a farm outside the town of Fredonia on the western edge of Caldwell County, and she unloaded the cows into the north pasture of the property she had inherited 3 months earlier from her grandmother, Ida Fales. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried on a Tuesday afternoon in August in a pasture in front of 19 cows she had just paid too much money for. But she stood at the gate for a long time and watched them. They walked slowly into the field. They found the shade of the walnut tree that had been planted by her grandfather, Wendell Fales, in 1971. They stood under the walnut tree and looked at her. Della looked back. She did not know it at that moment, but she had just done the second most important thing her family had done in 50 years. The first most important thing had been done quietly by a man named Wendell Fales in a bedroom of that same house in the summer of 1994, when he had put 40 leather-bound notebooks into a roll-top desk and locked the desk and hidden the key in a jewelry box that had belonged to his mother and had died 20 years later without ever telling anyone what was in the desk. But that story starts in April, 4 months earlier. Della Fales came home to Caldwell County on the 7th of April in a used Honda Civic with a broken passenger door handle and a suitcase in the trunk on the day of her grandmother's funeral. She was 23 years old. She had left Louisville the previous week for reasons she had not fully explained to herself in a series of small decisions that had felt at each individual moment minor. She had lost the marketing job at the healthcare startup on the 16th of March. She had lost the boyfriend on the 22nd. She had lost the apartment lease at the end of the month when the boyfriend had informed her with a straight face that his name was the only one on the paperwork. She had put the suitcase in the Civic. She had driven west. She had rented a room in a Best Western in Elizabethtown for 4 nights while she figured out what to do next. She had not at any point during those 4 nights expected to end up on a farm. Then, on the 5th of April, her father had called her from Nashville and told her that her grandmother Ida had died. Ida Fales was 74 years old. She had lived alone on the farm for 11 years since Wendell had died in the spring of 2014. She had run the farm alone. She had refused every year all of her son's offers of her help. She had refused every year all of her sister-in-law, Hetty Boone's offers of help. She had run the farm the way Wendell had taught her to run it, which is to say, slowly, without spending money. She did not have keeping just enough cattle to justify the ground and no more. She had died in her sleep in a chair by the window at 74 years old, with a cup of coffee still warm on the side table. Della's father, who lived in Nashville and worked in insurance and had not been back to the farm since Wendell's funeral, had told Della on the phone that the funeral was Tuesday, that he could not make it before Monday night, and that if Della was willing to drive over that afternoon and open up the house, he would appreciate it. Della had said yes. She had driven from Elizabethtown to Fredonia on the afternoon of the 6th of April. The drive had taken 2 hours and 20 minutes. By the time she had turned off Kentucky Route 91 onto the gravel road that led to the farm, the sun had been setting behind the ridge, and the light on the pasture had been the color of a copper kettle. She had stopped the Civic at the top of the drive. She had gotten out. She had stood beside the car and looked down the drive at the house. The house was a small white farmhouse with a tin roof and a front porch with a swing. It had been built by Wendell Fales' grandfather in 1912. It had not been painted in 11 years. It was still white, just less white than it had been. Della had stood beside the car for a long time. Then she had gotten back in. She had driven down the gravel road to the house. She had let herself in with the key her father had told her was under a specific brick beside the back porch, which had been the same brick since her grandfather had put it there in 1972. The house had smelled the same as it always had: wood smoke, old coffee, cedar, and faintly the sweet dry smell of pipe tobacco that had not been smoked in that house in 11 years, but which the walls apparently had never let go of. Della had walked through the front room. She had walked through the kitchen. She had stood at the sink for a long time and looked out the window at the pasture, which was empty in April because Ida had sold the last of the cattle in October. Then she had gone upstairs. She had slept in the bedroom she had slept in as a child. She had not cried that night either, but she had lain awake in the dark for a long time, listening to a house that had not had a living person in it since December, and thinking about a grandmother she had not visited enough, and thinking about a job she did not have, and a boyfriend she did not have, and an apartment she did not have, and a life in Louisville she was not going to go back to. She had thought at some point around 3 in the morning the sentence that would carry her through the next 4 years. The rope frayed before it broke. Then she had slept. The funeral was the following afternoon. The whole community came. Della had not been prepared for the number of people. She had grown up visiting the farm 2 or 3 times a year for holidays when she had been small, and she had come out less often as she had grown older. She had not understood until she stood in the receiving line at the Fredonia Baptist Church how many people in that part of the county had known Ida Fales. There were farmers. There were the wives of farmers. There were the children of farmers. There were feed store owners and equipment dealers and vets and neighbors and old church friends. There were 2 Danforths. There was 1 Hollis. There was 1 Bell. And there was 1 Boone. The 1 Boone was Aunt Hetty. Hetty Boone was 91 years old. She was Della's grandfather, Wendell's older sister. She was, in fact, the last surviving member of Wendell's generation on the Fales side of the family. Della had not seen her since Wendell's funeral 11 years earlier, and Hetty at that point had been 80. She had assumed for 11 years that her Aunt Hetty had passed. Nobody had told her otherwise. Nobody had mentioned Aunt Hetty at Christmas or on birthdays. Aunt Hetty had not sent cards. Della had, without ever thinking about it, filed her among the ghosts. But Hetty Boone was not a ghost. She was 91 years old and standing at the back of the receiving line in a wool coat that was too heavy for April, with her hair pinned back in a knot and her eyes the same clear gray Della remembered from when she was 6. Aunt Hetty came forward when it was her turn. She took Della's hand. She said, "Della." Della said, "Aunt Hetty." Aunt Hetty said, "I would like you to come out to my house tomorrow morning at 9. I have coffee." Della said, "All right." Aunt Hetty said, "There are things about your grandfather you should know. Your grandmother did not know how to tell you. She was going to. She ran out of time." Della said, "All right." Aunt Hetty said, 9 o'clock. My house is 3 miles east on Route 6. You will see the mailbox. It says Boone. Della said, "I will be there." Aunt Hetty squeezed her hand once. She moved on. Della watched her walk down the church aisle in a wool coat that must have weighed 10 pounds at 91 years old, without a cane, without a helper. And she thought for the first time since her grandmother had died 3 days earlier that she might not be as alone in Caldwell County as she had assumed. That night back at the farmhouse alone, Della did something she had not planned to do. She began to open drawers. She started in the kitchen. She was not looking for anything specifically. She told herself, just orienting. She had inherited the farm from her grandmother's will, which had been read on the morning of the funeral by a lawyer in Princeton. The farm, the house, and the 400 acres attached to it were legally hers now. Her father had signed off. Her uncle in Missouri had signed off. There were no other Fales heirs. She was at 23 years old, the owner of 400 acres of Caldwell County ground. She had no idea what to do with it. So she opened drawers. The kitchen drawers held what kitchen drawers hold: rubber bands, old receipts, a pack of birthday candles that had been in the drawer since she was 7, a rusted potato peeler, a small screwdriver that her grandfather had used to fix the toaster. She opened the sideboard in the dining room. She found her grandmother's wedding china. She found a photo album from 1972. She found a bundle of letters tied with green kitchen string that her grandmother had written to her grandfather while he was in the hospital for a week in 1981 with a heart scare that had turned out to be nothing. Della sat on the floor of the dining room and read 3 of them. They were not romantic letters in the modern sense. They were farm letters. They said things like, "The bay heifer calved out clean. Doc Bennett came by. He says all is well. I moved the black steer to the north field. He is looking good. But at the bottom of each letter in the same careful hand, her grandmother had written the same line. I love you. Come home when you can. Della folded the letters. She put them back where she had found them. She stood up. She went upstairs. She stood in the doorway of her grandparents' bedroom. She had not been in this room since she was 12 years old. The bed was made. The dresser was neat. The old roll-top desk that had belonged to Wendell was against the north wall, closed and locked exactly the way it had been every time she had ever seen it. She walked over to the desk. She had never seen it open. She had assumed for years that it had been locked because it contained tax records and old checkbooks and things her grandfather had not wanted a small granddaughter to bother with. She tried the roll top. It was still locked. She turned around. She looked at her grandmother's dresser. On the dresser was a small wooden jewelry box, painted white, with a rose on the lid. It had been there since Della could remember. Ida had kept her wedding ring in it, and a pair of pearl earrings, and a small enamel pin that had been her mother's. Della opened the jewelry box. She lifted out the tray. Under the tray was a small brass key. She knew without being told what it was for. She walked back over to the roll-top desk. She fit the key into the lock. She turned it. The lock clicked. The roll-top rolled up on its runners for the first time in what Della would later realize had been 31 years. Inside the desk were 40 leather-bound notebooks. 40. They were stacked in 2 neat piles, 20 in each stack in the 2 side compartments of the desk. They were bound in dark green leather. The corners of the leather had gone soft. The spines were numbered in her grandfather's hand in black ink, 1 through 40. Della sat down at the desk chair. She stared. She had not known there was a single notebook in that desk. She was looking at 40. She reached out. She lifted the first one from the top of the left-hand stack. Number 1. She opened it. The first page was dated the 3rd of March, 1971. Wendell would have been 39 years old. The handwriting was small and careful. The letters slightly slanted. The ink pressed hard into the paper, the way older men used to write when a pen was a serious object. The first line said, "Started keeping this book today. I am not the first fails to try to write things down about this ground, but I hope to be the first to keep going long enough that the writing means something." Della read it twice. She kept reading. Notebook number 1 covered the year 1971. It described the cattle Wendell had run that year, the pastures he had rotated them through, the springs he had found in the north field that summer, the weather, the prices, the neighbors, the crop that had come in, and the crop that had failed. It also described, in 3 different entries in July, a young cow that Wendell called number 7, who had lost her calf, and who Wendell had decided to keep anyway, because as he wrote on the 28th of July, the thin ones off the poor ground are the ones worth having if you know how to read them. Della read that line 4 times. She reached for notebook number 2. She kept reading. She read through the night. By 4 in the morning, she had gotten through notebooks 1, 2, and 3. She had learned things about her grandfather she had not known, that he had in fact been a much more scientific farmer than she had understood, that he had kept temperature records, that he had known the names of every fescue and clover variety in his fields, that he had in the summer of 1973 corresponded with an agronomist at the University of Kentucky about a specific type of drought-tolerant native grass he had wanted to try to re-establish in the western pasture. She had also learned in the last entry of notebook number 3, dated December of 1973, something that changed the way she read everything after. The entry said, "Ida is going to have a girl in the spring. I hope she is called after our mother. If I am ever gone before this girl grows up, and if she or her daughter ever finds this desk, I want her to know that I have written these books for her, not for anyone else. The land will keep for a long time, but it will not keep forever. Somebody has to remember how to read it. I have decided, for whatever it is worth, that I am going to write down what I know until I am done, and then I am going to leave the books in a place where whoever comes back will find them. W.F." Della read it 4 times. She set the notebook down. She got up. She walked over to the window. The sun was starting to come up over the eastern ridge. She had been reading for 6 hours. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had not made coffee. She had not checked her phone. She had read 48 pages of her grandfather's handwriting, and she had learned on the last page of the 3rd notebook that a man who had died when she was 12 years old had left 40 leather-bound volumes in a roll-top desk in a locked drawer, and had done so in his own written words for her. She had not known any of this until 4 in the morning on the 8th of April. The rope frayed before it broke. She had come home to Caldwell County, the way a person walks into a room she has been walking past for years, and she had opened a door, and she had found her grandfather waiting for her in 40 small green books on a March morning in 1971, 10 years before she was born. She closed the notebook. She stood at the window for another long moment. Then she said out loud to nobody, "All right, Grandpa, I am here." That was the 8th of April. At 9 in the morning on the 9th, Della drove 3 miles east on Route 6. She saw the mailbox that said Boone. She turned in. Aunt Hetty was on the front porch. There were 2 mugs of coffee on the small table between the 2 rocking chairs. Aunt Hetty said, "Sit down, honey." Della sat. Aunt Hetty said, "You opened the desk." Della said, "How did you know?" Aunt Hetty said, "Because I have been waiting since December for you to open it. I did not think it would take you 36 hours, but your grandfather always said you had his mother's head. I am glad to see he was right." Della said, "Aunt Hetty." "Yes, honey. There are 40 notebooks." Aunt Hetty said, "I know. I was there when he wrote most of them." Della said, "You were there." Aunt Hetty said, "Wendell was my little brother. I was 15 when he was born. I helped raise him. When he started keeping the notebooks in 1971, he brought them to me twice a year in the spring and in the fall, and he read them out loud to me on this porch, in these 2 chairs for 43 years. Della did not answer. Aunt Hetty said, "There is one more thing I need to tell you, and I need to tell you before you go any further into those books." Della said, "What is it?" Aunt Hetty said, "In the summer of 1962, when I was 30 years old and your grandfather was 29 and unmarried, I was already married to a man named Roy Boone." Aunt Hetty said, "Roy and I ran a farm 3 miles from here. We ran cattle on it. We were trying to do something with that ground that nobody else in the county was doing. We were trying to run thin cows off poor ground. We had 30 head. We were going to build to 100. Roy and I had it all planned. We had a notebook of our own." She paused. She said, "Roy died in April of 1968. His tractor rolled over in the north field. He was 36 years old." Della said, "Aunt Hetty." Aunt Hetty said, "I sold the cattle 6 months later. I could not do it alone, or I thought I could not. I was not brave enough. I was 36 years old. I gave up." She said, "Your grandfather took my notebook when I gave up. He kept it in his desk with his own. He started his own notebooks in 1971 because he had watched me quit and because he had decided, without ever saying so out loud, that he was going to keep writing until somebody in this family finished what Roy and I had started." She looked at Della. She said, "You are the one, honey. That is why he wrote them." Della said, "Aunt Hetty." Aunt Hetty said, "Yes." Della said, "I don't know anything about cattle." Aunt Hetty said, "You have 4 months, and you have 40 books, and you have me, and you have this ground, and you have your grandfather's springs in the west pasture, and your grandfather's mineral supplements at Otis Bell's feed store, and a doc named Bennett who owes your grandfather more than he can ever repay." She said, "That is a lot to work with for a girl who does not know anything about cattle." Della said, "4 months until what?" Aunt Hetty said, "Until the August sale." Della said, "What is at the August sale?" Aunt Hetty smiled a small, dry smile. She said, 19 thin cows, or something like 19. There always are at the August sale. They come off the ground that is run out of grass. They are the ones nobody wants. They are the ones your grandfather bought in his own August sales for 43 years. She said, "The thin ones off the poor ground are the ones worth having if you know how to read them." Della felt something move in her chest. She said, "The ground remembers." Aunt Hetty went very still. She said, "Where did you hear that?" Della said, "I found it in Notebook 15 last night. Grandfather wrote it in 1978. He said it was the shortest true sentence he had ever managed to write down." Aunt Hetty closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. She reached into the pocket of her wool coat. She took out a small leather booklet, black worn at the edges. She set it on the table between the 2 mugs of coffee. She said, "This is Roy's book, and mine, from 1962 to 1968. It is not much. It is what we were doing when he died. Your grandfather kept it for me. I got it back when he passed. I have kept it in my dresser for 11 years, waiting for you." She pushed it across the table. She said, "Now it is yours." Della picked it up. She did not open it. She said, "Aunt Hetty." Aunt Hetty said, "Yes." Della said, "What am I supposed to do?" Aunt Hetty said, "You are supposed to read the books, all of them, and you are supposed to walk the ground, all of it. And when August comes, you are supposed to go to the sale, and you are supposed to buy the thinnest, most bony, most unwanted cows on the back pen, and you are supposed to bring them home, and you are supposed to put them on your grandfather's springs, and you are supposed to see what the ground remembers." Della said, "That's it." Aunt Hetty said, "That's it, honey." Della said, "How many cows?" Aunt Hetty said, "As many as you can afford, but not one more." Della said, "And after August?" Aunt Hetty said, "After August, we will figure out the rest one winter at a time." Della drank her coffee. She sat on the porch with Aunt Hetty for another hour. Neither of them spoke for most of it. When Della drove home at 11, she had the small black leather booklet on the seat beside her, and she had the beginning of a plan. She spent the next 4 months reading. She read Notebook 4 in the first week of April. She read Notebooks 5 through 10 in the last 3 weeks of April, in the evenings after she had spent the days walking the 400 acres of the farm with a topographical map she had bought at the county extension office. She read Notebooks 11 through 20 in May. She read Notebooks 21 through 30 in June. She read Notebooks 31 through 39 in the first 3 weeks of July. She saved Notebook 40 for last. Notebook 40 had been started according to the date on the inside cover in January of 2014. Wendell had died in April of that year. He had written in Notebook 40 for 3 months and 13 days. The last entry was dated the 9th of April, 2014, 2 weeks before he died. Della read it on the last Sunday of July. She sat in the front room at the small mahogany table by the window, and she read the entry in the light of a late afternoon. The entry said, "I am not going to finish this book. I have known for some time. I am not writing this out of sadness. I am writing it out of arithmetic. There are things a man can no longer promise at 81. This is one of them. I am going to leave this book and the 39 others and Hetty's book with Roy's writing in the desk in our bedroom. I have asked Ida to keep the key in her mother's jewelry box. Ida will not open the desk. That is not her way. Neither will our son. That is not his way. If Ida outlives me by a long time, she will pass the farm to whoever wants it. If our granddaughter wants it, she will find it. If nobody wants it, then these books will go on to whatever cousin decides to clear the house out after all of us are gone. I do not know which grandchild will read this. I do not know your name, but I know your heart. If you are reading this, then you have come home. If you have come home, then the ground is going to speak to you. All I ask is that you listen. The ground remembers, and so at last will you. W.F. April 9th, 2014. Della sat at the mahogany table for a long time. She did not cry. She had told herself on the first day that she was not going to cry in that house, but she did close the notebook. She did put it gently on top of the other 39, and she did write that evening in her own notebook, the one she had started buying at the drugstore in Princeton in April. July 27th. Finished the last notebook. Grandpa wrote to me. He did not know my name, but he wrote to me. August 12th is the sale. Aunt Hetty says thin cows. Aunt Hetty says the poor ground. Aunt Hetty says the springs. I am going to the sale. I am going to buy as many as I can afford, and I am going to see. She underlined the last sentence. The August sale was on a Tuesday. Della drove to the stockyard in Princeton at 7 in the morning. She had $8,400 set aside from her grandmother's estate. She had in the passenger seat of the truck a folded sheet of paper with a list of numbers she had worked out with Aunt Hetty over the previous 3 weeks. Maximum bid per head, number of head, reserve for hay, reserve for fencing, reserve for the first winter. She had a canvas cap on her head that had belonged to her grandfather. She had her grandfather's wool jacket in the back seat in case the morning turned cold. She had in the inside pocket of her denim jacket a photocopy of the last page of Notebook 40. She parked in the gravel lot. She walked in. She stood at the back pen and looked at the 19 thin cows for 45 minutes before the auction started. She read them the way her grandfather had taught her to read them. She read them the way Aunt Hetty had described. She looked at their eyes first, then at their teeth, then at their coats, then at the way they stood. She saw in 3 of them a look she recognized from Notebook 9, a look Wendell had described as the look a cow has when she has been hungry but has not been beaten. She saw in 2 of them a Devon Cross ancestry that Wendell had specifically written about in Notebook 23 as being ideal for the ground she owned. She saw in the smallest one a heifer with a slightly darker patch on her shoulder, standing at the back of the pen, quiet with an unbroken gaze that she would later name Captain, though she did not know that yet. The auction started at 9. The 19 cows went up as a lot at 10:40. Marlon Pratt bid $430 a head. Della bid $442. Marlon Pratt shook his head. The gavel came down. The men in the corridor laughed. Buck Hollis said the sentence about dog food. Bo Pratt took the photograph, and Della Fales walked out of the Caldwell County stockyard with paperwork for 19 thin cows that nobody in western Kentucky had wanted, and she loaded them onto 2 hired stock trailers, and she drove them home to a farm outside Fredonia, and she put them on ground her grandfather had written about for 43 years. She did not know that afternoon that within 72 hours she would be sitting in the office of a bank president named Cyrus Danforth, and she would be told that her grandmother had signed a note for $92,000 in the spring of 2019, and that the note was due in 54 days, and that if she could not pay it, she would lose the farm. She did not know that yet, but she was about to find out. The bank was in a red brick building on the corner of Main and 3rd in Princeton, Kentucky, which was the county seat of Caldwell County and the closest thing to a real town for 20 miles in any direction. Della had not been inside First Kentucky Bank since she was 14 years old. Her grandmother had taken her once on a cold morning in October to open a Christmas Club account with $50 Della had earned selling zucchini at the roadside stand. She remembered the smell of the lobby, which was the same as most old country banks: floor wax, old paper, coffee that had been sitting on a warmer for too long. She walked in on the Monday after the auction. She was wearing clean jeans and her grandfather's old wool jacket, and the same work boots she had worn to the sale barn. There were 2 tellers behind the counter, one of them a woman in her 50s who Della recognized as the daughter of a neighbor 2 properties over, smiled when Della came in. "Della Fales," she said, "come to open an account." "Yes, ma'am." "Have a seat right there. Mr. Danforth will want to see you." Della sat. She did not know why Mr. Danforth would want to see her. She was about to find out. Cyrus Danforth was 55 years old. He was the president of First Kentucky Bank of Caldwell County. He was the 3rd generation of Danforths to hold that title. His grandfather, Silas Danforth, had founded the bank in 1929. His father, Ezra Danforth, had run it from 1962 until his death in 2005. Cyrus had taken over the next day. Cyrus was tall, thin, and quiet in a way that made other men lean forward when he spoke. He wore a gray suit with a burgundy tie. His hair was cut short. His hands were long and pale and did not in any way look like the hands of a man who had ever worked outside. He came out of his office at 9:20. He shook Della's hand. He said, "Miss Fales." She said, "Mr. Danforth." He said, "Come on back." She followed him down a hallway with a runner carpet gone thin in the middle from 40 years of shoes. His office was at the end. It had a big window that looked out onto 3rd Street. There were framed photographs on the wall behind his desk. His father, his grandfather, Cyrus himself, at some ribbon cutting standing next to the mayor. He offered her the chair across from his desk. She sat. He did not sit right away. He walked to the window. He looked out. He said, I was very sorry to hear about your grandmother Della. Thank you. Ida was a good woman. She kept her word. Yes, sir. She kept it, in fact, longer than any woman I've ever done business with in this county. Della did not answer. She did not know what he meant. She was about to find out. Cyrus turned from the window. He sat down behind his desk. He opened a manila folder that had been sitting there when they came in. He said, Miss Fales, I want to be respectful of your time and of your grief. So I am going to tell you what is in this folder as plainly as I can, and then I am going to give you a range of options, which we can talk through today or over the course of a week, whichever you prefer. She said, just tell me. He nodded. He said, in April of 2019, your grandmother took out an operating loan from this bank in the amount of $92,000. She used the farm as collateral. The loan was structured as a 5-year balloon with quarterly interest payments and a principal payment due on the 15th of April, 2024. He paused. He said she missed the principal payment. Della felt her stomach drop. Cyrus said, she was ill by then. She did not tell you. She did not tell anyone. She contacted my father's former assistant, who is still on staff here, and asked for a hardship extension. We gave her one. 12 months. April 15th of this year. He looked at Della. He said, that deadline is 54 days from tomorrow morning. Della did not answer. He said the outstanding principal with accrued interest and fees is $87,412. She said, how much of that did she pay before she died? He said she kept up the interest every quarter, right until the end. Della closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. She said, what are the options? Cyrus Danforth folded his hands on the desk. He said, option 1. You pay $87,412 by the 15th of April. That closes the note. You keep the farm. Option 2. You refinance the balance under a new note. We would need to see a farm business plan and projected revenue. Given the current condition of the herd on the property, which I understand is minimal, and the state of the equipment, that would be a very difficult application to approve, but we could try. Option 3, he paused. He said, you sell the bank 200 acres of the western pasture. That's the flatter ground closer to the county road. We would pay you fair market for it, which is $2,200 per acre right now, though the trend is downward. That comes to $440,000. From that, we would take the $87,000 and clear the note. You would net $353,000 in cash. You would keep the house, the barns, and the 200 acres of hill and woodlot to the east, and you would owe nothing to this bank. He stopped. He said, that is the option I would strongly recommend. Della looked at him. She said, $2,200 an acre. He said, that is fair market. She said, the last comparable sale in this county was 3 years ago. It was $1,800 an acre. Prices have not gone up. What makes you think this land is worth $2,200? Cyrus did not blink. He said, I have thought about it, and I am prepared to be generous given the family's long history with this bank. Della sat quietly. She thought about the walk she had taken through the western pasture 2 weeks before. She thought about the springs she had marked. She thought about the map her grandfather had drawn in Notebook 17, showing exactly which fields held water in a dry year and which fields did not. The western pasture was the best land on the farm. Cyrus Danforth knew that. He was not offering to be generous. He was offering to take the best 200 acres and let her keep the worst. Della said, "I would like a copy of the note, Mr. Danforth, and a copy of the amortization schedule, and a copy of the appraisal you used for the collateral valuation in 2019. Cyrus said, "I can have those to you by the end of the week. Today would be better." He looked at her for a long second. Then he said, "By close of business." She said, "Thank you." She stood up. He stood up. He said, "Della." She looked at him. He said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it." "All right. Your grandmother tried to hold this farm together for a long time, longer than most people would have, but there are seasons in a family when the smart thing to do is take the offer that is on the table. 54 days is not a long time, and a young woman who has just come home from Louisville without cattle experience, without capital, without a husband or a partner to help her is not going to raise $87,000 in 54 days from a herd of 19 bony cows. He said it gently. He said it the way a man says a thing he thinks is true. Della looked at him. She said, "Mr. Danforth, I have not asked you for your opinion. I have asked you for 3 pieces of paper. May I have them today, please?" His face did not move, but something in his eyes did. He said, "By close of business." She said, "Thank you." She walked out of his office down the hallway with the thin carpet past the 2 tellers out the front door onto Main Street. She got into her grandfather's truck. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel for a long time. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried on Main Street in Princeton, Kentucky at 9:45 in the morning, but she gripped the steering wheel hard enough that when she finally let go, the pattern of the plastic was still pressed into her palms. She drove home. She did not tell Aunt Hetty right away. She did not tell her father when he called that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the copy of the note that a bank clerk had delivered at 4:30 that afternoon, and she read it 3 times. The note was legitimate. The amount was correct. The signature at the bottom was her grandmother's, in the small, careful hand Della had seen 100 times on Christmas cards and grocery lists and birthday envelopes. Ida Fales had signed away the farm on the 4th of April 2019. Della understood sitting at that table at 11:15 at night with the wind coming through the crack in the kitchen window and a mug of coffee gone cold beside her, that her grandmother had done it for a reason. There had been a bad year in 2018. Della remembered it dimly, a summer of drought, a fall of low prices, a winter of high feed bills. Ida had been a widow by then for 4 years. Wendell had died in the spring of 2014, and Ida had run the farm alone from that April forward, and she had been 68 years old in 2019, and she had been proud, and she had not asked her son for help, and she had not asked her granddaughter for help, and she had walked into First Kentucky Bank on the 4th of April 2019, and she had signed a note for $92,000 because the alternative was watching everything her husband had built for 43 years come apart. Della understood that. She was not angry with her grandmother. She was, if anything, more determined than she had been that morning. She turned the note over. She wrote on the back in pencil, 54 days. Then she went to bed. The next morning she drove out to Aunt Hetty's. Aunt Hetty was on the porch already with 2 mugs of coffee poured. That was a habit of hers. She always seemed to know when someone was coming. Della had asked her once how she did it. Aunt Hetty had said, "I don't, but I always pour 2 mugs. If nobody comes, I drink the second one." Della sat down. She said, "Aunt Hetty." "Yes, honey." "Did Grandma tell you about the loan?" Aunt Hetty went very still. Then she said, "She told me in the spring of 2019. "Why did nobody tell me?" "Because your grandmother did not want you to know." "Why not?" "Because she loved you and she thought you had enough to carry. You had just started that job in Louisville. She thought you were going to build something up there. She did not want to pull you back here for something she thought she could handle." Della said, "Could she have handled it?" Aunt Hetty took a sip of her coffee. She said she could have handled the interest. She could not have handled the principal. Della said, "Then why did she sign?" Aunt Hetty looked at her. She said, "Because Ezra Danforth's son came to see her the week before." Della felt something turn cold in her chest. She said, "Cyrus." "Cyrus? What did he tell her?" Aunt Hetty said, "He told her that if she did not take the operating loan, the bank would not extend her line of credit for the fall corn purchase, and if she did not have corn for the winter, the cows would not make it through, and if the cows did not make it through, the farm would go under anyway. So she took the operating loan, and she used it for corn, and the cows made it through the winter. But by the spring of 2020, the price of cattle had dropped, and by 2021, your grandmother was 69 and starting to get the shakes in her hands, and she made a decision in the summer of 2022 that she was not going to buy any more corn, and she was going to run down the herd, and she was going to keep the farm just barely alive until she could pass it on to whichever grandchild wanted it. Della did not answer. Aunt Hetty said, "She passed it to you, honey, and Cyrus Danforth has been waiting for that pass since 2019. Della said, "Why?" Aunt Hetty said, "Because his father tried to buy that western pasture in 1993, and his father before that tried to buy it in 1962, and your great-grandfather said no, and your grandfather said no, and your grandmother said no, and now it's your turn to say no." Della said, "Aunt Hetty, yes, honey. 19 Bony cows are not going to pay off $87,000 in 54 days. Aunt Hetty said, "No, honey, they are not." Della said, "Then what am I supposed to do?" Aunt Hetty set her coffee cup down. She said, "You are going to do what your grandfather would have done. You are going to sit at your kitchen table tonight, and you are going to read the notebooks, and you are going to look for the sentences he wrote about hard years, because there are sentences in there about hard years. I know because I helped him write some of them. And when you have read those sentences, you are going to figure out what parts of this farm can be sold to pay part of the note. And you are going to go back to Cyrus Danforth, and you are going to offer him something that is not 200 acres, and you are going to make him take it, because he is a man who wants to look generous, and a man who wants to look generous can be moved." Della did not answer. Aunt Hetty said, "But not today, honey." Della said, "Not today." Aunt Hetty said, "Today we drink our coffee. Today we sit on this porch. Today we let the fear pass, because if you go back to that man today, he will smell it on you. And you do not want him to smell fear. You want him to smell patience. Patience is the one thing his family has never had. That is why they have to buy what they cannot grow." Della drank her coffee. They sat on the porch for another hour. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the maple tree at the end of the drive. A car went by on the county road. Somewhere out in the pasture, one of the 19 cows lowed once softly and then was quiet. Della drove home at 11:30. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened Notebook 22. She started to read. She was going to be all right. She just needed to find the sentence. The sentence came in Notebook 24 in an entry dated September of 1987. It said, "In a hard year, sell the standing timber, not the ground. Timber grows back, ground does not." Della read it 3 times. She looked out the window. She could see from the kitchen the edge of the woodlot that ran along the eastern boundary of the farm. 200 acres of hardwood, white oak, hickory, some walnut in the low ground, some cherry along the ridges. Her grandfather had timbered it once in 1979 and once more in 1998 and had not touched it since. He had marked the trees carefully both times. He had left the mother trees standing. He had let the woods grow. She got up. She got her jacket. She drove to town. She stopped at Bell Feed and Farm, and she asked Otis Bell, who was standing behind the counter with his coffee, whether he knew a timber buyer he trusted. Otis Bell was 70 years old. He wore a canvas apron over a green flannel shirt. He had been running that feed store for 42 years. He had known Della's grandfather better than anyone in the county except Aunt Hetty. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You looking to sell timber?" "Not all of it. Select cut, enough to raise about $90,000. Otis Bell set down his coffee. He said, "How fast?" 52 days. Otis Bell whistled softly. He said, "That is a tight window." "I know." He said, "There is a man in Hopkins County named Levi Marsh. He has been timbering the Green River bottom for 30 years. He is fair. He does not lie about tree count, and he can move fast when he needs to." She said, "Would you call him for me?" "I will call him tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Bell." He said, "One more thing, Della." "Yes, sir." "If you sell that timber, sell it right. Do not let anyone convince you to take a lump sum without a per board foot audit. Your grandfather made me promise back in 1998 that if his grandchildren ever timbered that woodlot, I would tell them exactly that." Della said, "He made you promise." Otis Bell said, "He made a lot of people promise things. That is how he built the farm, one promise at a time, from men who kept them." Della drove home that afternoon with a piece of paper in her jacket pocket that had Levi Marsh's phone number written on it in Otis Bell's careful hand. She called him that night. Levi Marsh drove out on Thursday. He walked the woodlot with her for 6 hours. He did not talk much. He counted trees. He measured trunks. He looked at the crowns and the bark and the way the branches had grown, and he did calculations in a small notebook he carried in his back pocket. At the end of the day, he stood with Della at the edge of the woodlot and said, "Miss Fales." "Yes, sir." "You can pull about $96,000 out of this stand with a select cut that leaves the mother trees, the walnut, and the cherry along the north ridge alone. I will pay you $64 a ton for the oak and $42 a ton for the hickory. That is fair market at Louisville right now, minus my haul. You will need to sign a contract with a per board foot audit clause. I do not mind. I have signed 100 of those. If you sign this week, I can be cutting by the middle of March and finished by the last week of March. I will pay in 3 tranches, 20% on signing, 50% at midpoint, 30% on completion." Della said, "How much on signing?" Levi Marsh said, $19,200. Della said, "How much by April 10th? Levi Marsh said, $67,200. Della said, "I need $87,412 by April 15th. Levi Marsh said, "You will have it by April 10th. if you signed by Friday. She signed on Friday. She did not tell Cyrus Danforth. She did not tell anyone except Aunt Hetty and Otis Bell. She waited. Levi Marsh moved his crew in on March 14th. For 2 weeks the sound of chainsaws and skidders came out of the eastern woods from 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. Della walked out there once a day. She checked the marked trees against the cut trees. She did not find a single discrepancy. Levi Marsh was a man who did what he said he would do. By April 8th, the cutting was done. By April 10th, the final wire transfer hit Della's account at First Kentucky Bank. She had $88,600 in cash. She waited until April 13th. She let 2 days pass because Aunt Hetty had told her that a man who wants to look generous cannot be given the chance to soften his offer at the last minute. On April 13th at 10 in the morning, she walked into First Kentucky Bank. She asked to see Mr. Danforth. Cyrus Danforth came out of his office with a small, prepared smile. He shook her hand. He said, "Della, I was hoping you would come in." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Have you thought about our conversation?" She said, "I have." He said, "Would you like to sit down?" She said, "Yes, sir." They walked back to his office. They sat down. He said, "You know, Della, I have been thinking I would like to raise our offer. I know the market has been slow, but I have talked to the board, and we would be willing to go to $2,300 an acre." She said, "Mr. Danforth." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have brought you a cashier's check." She took it out of the inside pocket of her jacket. She set it on his desk. It was made out to First Kentucky Bank of Caldwell County. The amount was $87,412. Cyrus Danforth did not move for a long moment. Then he picked up the check. He looked at it. He said, "Where did this come from?" She said, "I sold timber." He said, "You sold timber?" "Yes, sir." He said, "Which stand?" She said, "The Eastern Woodlot. Select cut, $96,000 gross, $88,600 after expenses. My grandfather timbered that stand twice in his lifetime and always paid off a note with it. I did not think I was doing anything he had not already shown me how to do." Cyrus Danforth held the check. He did not put it down. He said, "Della." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are aware that this closes the note, but does not solve the underlying problem." She said, "What underlying problem?" He said, "You have a farm with 19 head of cattle, no operating capital, no line of credit, and no revenue stream. You have preserved the ground for the moment, but you have not built a farm. If you have another bad year or another hard winter, you will be back in this office asking for another loan, and this bank at that point will not be in a position to help you." Della looked at him. She said, "Mr. Danforth." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not come here today for advice. I came here to close a note that my grandmother signed 6 years ago under pressure your father put on her, and your grandfather put on my grandfather, and your great-grandfather tried to put on my great-grandfather, and every one of them said no. I am saying no. I am not going to sell you 200 acres. I am not going to sell you 20. I am not going to sell you 2. She said, "Please issue me a paid-in-full receipt and a release of collateral. I will wait in the lobby." Cyrus Danforth held the check for another few seconds. Then he set it down. He said, "Della." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I did not know your grandmother signed under pressure. I want you to know that. Whatever my father did in 2019, he did without consulting me. I did not sit at that table. She said, but you sat at every table after. He said, that is fair. He said, I am going to have the paperwork ready in 15 minutes. She said, thank you. She walked out of his office. She sat in the lobby. The teller, who was the daughter of her neighbor, smiled at her from behind the counter. Della smiled back. She waited. 15 minutes later, Cyrus Danforth came out with a folder. He handed her the release of collateral, the paid-in-full receipt, and a copy of the deposited check. He said, Della. She said, yes, sir. He said, for what it is worth, my father would not have raised the offer to $2,300. That was me. And I would like you to know that if you ever need a line of credit for this farm on fair terms, I will personally underwrite it. Della looked at him. She said, thank you, Mr. Danforth. She said, but I don't think I will need one. She walked out into the April sunlight. She got into her grandfather's truck. She drove home. She was by any measure a bank ever used still poor. She had $112 left in the account after the check cleared. She had 19 bony cows in her pasture. She had a farm that would need repairs before summer. She had no husband, no partner, no operating capital, and no line of credit. But she also had 400 acres of Kentucky ground, free and clear, that no Danforth was ever going to buy from a Fales. That was Wednesday. The following Sunday, at 7 o'clock in the evening, she drove out to Aunt Hetty's with a bottle of ginger ale and a peach pie she had bought at the IGA. Aunt Hetty was on the porch already with 2 mugs of coffee. Della said, I did it. Aunt Hetty said, I know, honey. Della said, how? Aunt Hetty said, Otis Bell called me the day you signed the timber contract. Otis and I have had an arrangement since your grandfather died. Otis calls me when a Fales does something Wendell would have been proud of. I don't call him when I hear the same, but he calls me. Della smiled. She sat down. She said, Aunt Hetty. Yes, honey. There is one more thing. Aunt Hetty looked at her. Della said, the winter is coming. The 19 cows have been on this ground for 6 months. They are stronger than they were, but they are not ready for a hard January, and I do not have the operating capital to buy hay if the pasture goes short. Aunt Hetty said, no, you don't. Della said, so I need to think about winter. Aunt Hetty said, yes. Della said, but not tonight. Aunt Hetty said, no, honey. Tonight we have peach pie. They had peach pie. They sat on the porch until the sun went down behind the ridge to the west, and the crickets started, and the temperature dropped enough that Della had to go inside for her grandfather's wool jacket. She drove home at 9:15. She did not know at that moment that in 10 days a storm would come across Caldwell County, and someone in her own community would open the north gate of her pasture in the middle of a snowstorm, and 3 of her 19 cows would walk out into the drifts, and she would find boot prints in the snow that did not belong to any coyote or any wolf, and she would sit in her barn at 4 o'clock in the morning and cry for the first time since her grandmother had died in December. But she would also in the same barn on the same night look up from her tears and see Aunt Hetty standing in the doorway in a wool coat at the age of 91, having driven her own truck 3 miles in a snowstorm to sit with her grandniece and say the only thing that mattered, you don't stop, Della. That's the whole trick. You just don't stop. That was still 10 days away. Tonight was peach pie. Tonight was a banknote closed on Wednesday afternoon and a paid-in-full receipt folded in the glove compartment of her grandfather's truck, and a herd of 19 bony cows sleeping in a field that would not be sold for as long as she was breathing. Tonight was enough. The storm came on the second Wednesday of January. It was not the storm anyone had been expecting. The National Weather Service had said flurries, 2 to 3 inches, cold but nothing dangerous. That was the forecast Della had heard at 6 in the morning on the kitchen radio, and it was the forecast she had trusted when she went out at 9 to check the cows and refill the mineral tubs. But by 2 in the afternoon, the wind had shifted. By 4, the flurries had turned into a driving snow that came sideways off the western ridge. By 7, the county road was closed. By 10, the wind was strong enough that Della could hear it moving the shingles on the north side of the house. She went to bed at 11. She woke up at 3:27 in the morning. She woke up because she heard something, not the wind, not the shingles, something under those sounds, a metallic clink, distant, wrong. She sat up, she listened, she heard it again, the sound of a metal gate latch out at the north end of the property, moving in a way it should not have been moving. Della was out of bed in 15 seconds. She dressed in the dark, wool socks, insulated pants, 2 shirts, her grandfather's wool jacket, the heavy coat over that, boots, the wool cap she had inherited from him, a flashlight from the top of the dresser. She went down the back stairs. She stepped out into the storm. The snow was up to her knees on the porch. The wind hit her like a hand across the face. She turned the flashlight on. She walked toward the north pasture. It took her 22 minutes to reach the north gate. By the time she got there, she could feel the cold in her fingers even through 2 pairs of gloves. She raised the flashlight. The north gate was open, not blown open, not damaged, open. The chain had been unhooked. The latch had been lifted. The gate was standing at a 45-degree angle to the fence line, and the snow drift on the pasture side had blown across it so that the tracks of any cattle that had walked through were already half filled in. She counted. She could see in the flashlight beam the vague shapes of the cows huddled at the far end of the pasture near the woodlot. 9 of them, then 8 more closer to the barn. 17. She had 19. She was missing 2. She stood in the doorway of the gate. She turned the flashlight down at the snow. She saw along the outside of the fence line, where the drift had not yet covered them, boot prints. They were not hers. They were size 11s, maybe 12s. The tread was a lug pattern, deep and irregular, the kind of tread on a work boot that had been resoled at least once. The prints came from the direction of the county road. They went back the same way. There were no other prints, not a coyote, not a wolf, not a stray dog, not the wind. A man had walked onto her land in a snowstorm at some point between 11 and 3, and he had unhooked the chain on her north gate, and he had lifted the latch, and he had walked back to the county road, and he had known that the storm would cover his tracks before dawn. He had not known that Della Fales, at the age of 23, was going to hear the sound of a metal gate latch moving 3 miles away in a storm, and put on 2 pairs of gloves and walk 22 minutes through knee-deep snow to see what was wrong. She closed the gate. She chained it. She walked back to the barn. She sat down on a bale of hay just inside the door. She was too cold to cry at first. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes waiting for her hands to warm up enough to close. Then she cried. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding something for a long time and it has finally cracked. Not loud, not big, just steady in the dark with the wind moving across the tin roof above her and the smell of hay and cows and old wood all around her and the sound of the storm outside going on and on. She did not hear the truck. She did not know how Aunt Hetty had known. But at 4:08 in the morning, the barn door opened. Aunt Hetty stood in the doorway in a heavy wool coat and a scarf pulled up around her chin and boots that were too big for her feet. Her white hair was under a knit cap. She had driven 3 miles from her own house in a snowstorm at the age of 91 in a 1986 Ford pickup with tires that were older than Della. She did not ask how many. She did not ask who. She said, "Move over, honey." Della moved over. Aunt Hetty sat down beside her on the bale. They sat there in silence for a long time. Then Aunt Hetty said, "I was in this barn at 4 in the morning in February of 1968. Della did not answer. Aunt Hetty said, "The night Roy died on the tractor. I did not know he was dead yet. I only knew he had not come home. I walked from the house to this barn because I did not know where else to go. I sat on this same hay bale, not this exact bale, but one right here in this corner. I stayed until sunrise. Then Wendell came and told me." Della said, "Aunt Hetty." "Yes, honey." Della said, "Somebody opened the gate." Aunt Hetty said, "I know, honey." "How?" "I saw the boot prints from the road when I drove in. They come from just where the shoulder widens half a mile down. That is where he parked, whoever it was." Della said, "I have 2 cows missing." Aunt Hetty said, "We will find them at first light. Cows go downhill in a storm. They will be in the low draw west of the timber road. We will get the truck in there tomorrow morning and bring them back." Della said, "What if they are dead?" Aunt Hetty said, "Then they are dead, and you will have 17, and you will start with 17. That is 1 less than the number you started with in August. And the difference between 19 and 17 is not the difference between succeeding and failing. It is just 2 cows. Della said, "Aunt Hetty." "Yes, honey, I know who did it." Aunt Hetty went very still. She said, "Do you?" Della said, "Not who, but what kind of who? This is not Cyrus Danforth. Cyrus does not walk in a snowstorm. Cyrus sends letters. This is somebody who wants me to fail, because if I fail, the whole idea fails. And if the whole idea fails, the man who bought his cattle at auction for good money for the last 20 years does not have to feel bad about buying his cattle at auction for good money for the next 20 years. Aunt Hetty said, "Buck Hollis." Della said, "Buck Hollis, or somebody who works for Buck Hollis, or somebody who wants Buck Hollis to owe them a favor." Aunt Hetty said, "That is a very grown-up sentence, Della." Della said, "I have had a lot of hours to think about it in the last 3 months." Aunt Hetty said, "What are you going to do about it?" Della said, "Nothing tonight." Aunt Hetty said, "That is the right answer." Della said, "But I am going to do something." Aunt Hetty said, "That is also the right answer." They sat there for another few minutes. Then Aunt Hetty said, "You know what your grandfather would say right now?" Della said, "What?" Aunt Hetty said he would say, "You don't stop, Della. That's the whole trick. You just don't stop." Della did not answer. She could not for a moment. Aunt Hetty said, "He said that to me the morning after Roy died. I did not stop. I did not stop for 57 years, and I am not going to stop tonight, and neither are you." Della wiped her face on the sleeve of her coat. She said, "Okay." Aunt Hetty said, "Okay." They sat until sunrise. At 6:40, when the light finally came up over the eastern ridge, they walked out to the truck together, and Aunt Hetty drove home in the same '86 Ford, and Della called Otis Bell at the feed store, and Otis Bell, who did not open the store until 8, answered on the second ring. Della said, "Mr. Bell." Otis Bell said, "Della." She said, "Somebody opened my north gate last night." Otis Bell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will be there in 40 minutes. By 8 o'clock, 3 trucks were parked at the Fales barn. Otis Bell was one, Doc Bennett was another, Aunt Hetty's in the third. By 9, the 3 of them and Della had walked the fence line, measured the boot prints, taken photographs, and driven the frozen back road down to the low draw west of the timber road, where they found the 2 missing cows sheltering behind a fallen oak, cold and shaken but alive. By noon, all 19 cows were back in the north pasture, and the chain on the north gate had been replaced with a new one that could not be unhooked without wire cutters, and Della had made a phone call to the county sheriff's office to file a report that would not lead anywhere, but which would put a piece of paper on record in case a piece of paper was ever needed later. By 3 in the afternoon, Della was back in the kitchen with notebook 27 open on the table in front of her, and she was reading in her grandfather's handwriting an entry from January of 1979. It said, "Somebody cut the wire on the south fence last week. I will not say who. I know who. He knows I know. But I will not say, because if I say, I will spend the next 10 years thinking about him instead of the cattle, and the cattle are what matter." Della read it 3 times. She turned the page. She wrote in her own notebook, the one she had started that summer, "Somebody opened the north gate last night. I know who. I will not say, because I have a farm to run and a note that is paid off and a herd of 19 cows that just walked back into my pasture on their own 4 feet, and the year is only 12 days old, and I have 353 days left to prove that this is a farm and not a joke." She closed the notebook. She stood up. She went out to check on the cows. The spring came early that year. By the middle of March, the pastures were greening. By the last week of March, the calves had started dropping. By the first week of April, Della had 9 live calves on the ground, 17 mother cows still on their feet, and the 2 cows she had walked back from the low draw in January were showing the first signs of being pregnant again. She had not expected that. She had expected losses. She had expected the January storm to break a couple of them, and she had expected the calving season to break a couple more, and she had expected to walk into the summer of that first year with maybe 22 head total if she was lucky, and closer to 18 if she was not. Instead, by the second week of April, she had 26. The 19 originals, 9 calves, 2 she had not counted, and Captain. Captain was the biggest of the calves, born on the 4th of April to a Devon Cross heifer that had been the second thinnest of the original 19 at the auction. The heifer had been slow all winter. Della had watched her carefully. She had fed her a little extra mineral. She had read 3 separate entries in Notebook 15 about what to do with a first-time mother who did not look like she was going to hold on. The Devon Cross had held on. She had calved standing up at 4 in the morning in the north pasture, and Della had come out with a flashlight and had watched her without interfering, because that was what Wendell Fales had written to do when a thin cow calved in April in cool weather. Do not interfere unless you have to. She had not had to. The calf came out clean. The mother had licked it dry within 12 minutes. It had stood wobbling at 19 minutes. It had nursed at 37. Della had walked back to the house at 5:15 in the morning in the gray-blue light before dawn, and she had written in her own notebook, 4th of April, Devon Cross Heifer number 7, bull calf, healthy, big for the mother, standing at 19 minutes, nursing at 37. I am going to call him Captain. She had underlined the last sentence. Then she had gone to bed. By the time she woke up at 10, Aunt Hetty was on the front porch with a peach pie and a covered dish of biscuits and gravy. Aunt Hetty said, "How is he?" Della said, "How did you know?" Aunt Hetty said, "The wind was right last night. I heard the heifer bellowing at 3:30. I have known that sound for 70 years. I called Doc Bennett at 4 to make sure you were not out of your depth. He was already halfway here. He turned around when he saw your lights in the pasture." Della said, "He came out. He came halfway. He turned around when he saw you had it. He didn't call me. He would not do that. He would only come if he thought you needed him." Della sat down on the porch. She said, "Captain." Aunt Hetty said, "That is a good name for a calf, a little presumptuous for a bull, but he will grow into it if he is going to." Della said, "He will grow into it." Aunt Hetty smiled. She said, "That is the first time I have heard you say a sentence like that in the whole first year." Della said, "It is the first time it is true." Aunt Hetty did not answer. She just squeezed Della's shoulder once, and she went inside to put the peach pie in the refrigerator. That was April. By June, Della had a routine. Up at 5, cattle check at 5:30, water tubs by 6:15, breakfast at 7, fence walk 2 days a week, trip into town for feed and mail on Fridays, Aunt Hetty on Sundays. The cows were putting on weight. The calves were growing. The pasture, which she had been so worried about in March, was holding up better than she had expected. She had walked it every week with a notebook, and she had rotated the herd every 4 days, moving them from one paddock to the next using a portable electric wire her grandfather had bought in the 90s and never used, and the ground she left behind had come back green every time. The system was working, not because Della was a genius, because Wendell Fales had spent 43 years figuring out which pastures held up under rotation and which ones did not, and Della had spent 4 months reading his notebooks, and she was following the map he had drawn. She was not inventing anything. She was translating. By the end of June, she had a small revenue stream. She sold 2 open cows to a buyer in Christian County for $600 each. She sold half of her hay crop, which she had baled with a rented baler off the south field, for $2,200. She sold 4 dozen eggs a week to the IGA in Princeton, which was not much, but was steady, and she sold a quarter beef in July to a family in Louisville who had heard about her through a college friend of hers. The quarter beef was a small thing, but it was the thing that changed everything, because when the family in Louisville tasted the beef, they told a chef. The chef was named Marcus Whitcomb, and he ran a farm-to-table restaurant in the Highlands neighborhood of Louisville, and he called Della on the 18th of July from a number she did not recognize. Marcus said, "Miss Fales." She said yes. He said, "I ate a piece of your ribeye last night." She said, "All right." He said, "I would like to buy a whole steer from you." She said, "I have one that will be ready in October." He said, "I will pay you $9 a pound, hanging weight, prepaid, half now, half on delivery. She said $9. He said $9. She said the commodity price is $4.82. He said, I am not paying commodity. I am paying grass-fed, dry-aged Caldwell County, ground and water. I have been looking for a source for 2 years. Please do not talk me down. She said, all right, Mr. Whitcomb. He said, Marcus. She said, Marcus. He said, one more thing. If this works, I will take 3 a year. And I have 4 chef friends in Louisville and 1 in Nashville who will take the same. That is 20 steers a year minimum at $9 a pound. I need you to grow your operation, Della, but grow it slow. I want the same beef in 3 years that I ate last night. She said, I understand. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then she opened her notebook. She wrote, July 18th, Marcus Whitcomb, Louisville, $9 a pound hanging, 20 steers a year projection, grow slow, do not lose the ground. She underlined the last sentence. She circled it twice. She was not going to lose the ground, not for Cyrus Danforth, not for Buck Hollis, not for a chef in Louisville, not ever. By August, she was starting to think about the second winter. She had $9,200 in the account from the timber contract remainder, the summer beef sale, and the eggs. She had a signed order from Marcus Whitcomb for a hanging steer in October that would bring in another $6,200. She had, in short, more operating capital in August of her first full year than her grandmother had had in any August of the last 6 years of her life. She was, if she was careful, going to be all right. But August was also when Buck Hollis came to see her for the first time. Buck Hollis was 58 years old. He owned 680 acres north of the Fales Place on the other side of the Green River Road, and he ran 300 head of commercial black baldy cattle on it, and he had been the biggest cattleman in Caldwell County for 15 years. He drove a white Ford F350 with a chrome brush guard and a co-op sticker on the back window. He pulled into Della's driveway on the last Saturday of August at 10 in the morning. He got out of the truck. He wore a starched shirt with pearl snaps, dark jeans, and a straw cowboy hat that looked like it had never been rained on. He walked over to where Della was fixing a hose bib on the north side of the house. He said, Miss Fales. She said, Mr. Hollis. He said, I have been meaning to come by for a while. She said, have you? He said, I have. She stood up. She wiped her hands on a rag. She said, what can I do for you, Mr. Hollis? He said, I heard you calved out 9 live in April. 9 live in April, 10 now, 10, and 2 more coming this fall. He whistled softly. He said, that is a good year for a herd of 19. She said, it is. He said, I also heard you sold a steer to a restaurant in Louisville. She said, I did. He said, how much? Enough. He smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who was trying to figure out something he had not figured out yet. He said, I want to make you an offer. She said, 4. He said, for the whole herd, all 26 head, plus the 2 carrying calves, 28 head cash on the barrel at $1,400 per head. That comes to $39,200. You would clear it in 1 afternoon, and you would not have to worry about the second winter. Della looked at him. She said, Mr. Hollis. Yes. She said, $1,400 a head is below commodity. He said, commodity has been dropping. She said, not that fast. He said, it has for older cows on thin ground. She said, Mr. Hollis, my cows are not thin, and this ground is not thin, and you know both of those things. Buck Hollis did not answer right away. Then he said, Della. She said, yes, sir. He said, you have done well this year, better than I expected. I will give you that. She said, thank you. He said, but I have been running cattle in this county for 32 years, and I have watched a lot of young farmers put together a good first year. Some of them put together a good second year. Almost none of them put together a good third year, because the third year is when the winter gets long and the pasture goes short and the pump breaks and the vet bill comes due and the equipment finally rusts through, and there is no husband and no partner and no father and no man in the house to lift the heavy end. And that is when a person sells the herd in the spring for less than they would have gotten in the fall because they are tired. He said it kindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he thinks is true. Della looked at him. She said, Mr. Hollis, my grandfather ran this farm for 43 years without a man in the house to lift the heavy end because he was the man in the house. And my grandmother ran it for 11 years after he died when nobody thought a woman her age could do it. And my great-aunt Hetty is 91 years old, and she still hauls her own hay off her back 40 every June alone in a 1986 Ford. So please do not tell me that this farm needs a man to lift the heavy end. It has been holding up the heavy end without one for a long time. Buck Hollis did not answer. He took off his hat. He looked at the ground. He said, that is fair. Della said, 1,400 a head is not. He said, no. He said, it is not. He put his hat back on. He said, Miss Fales. She said, yes, sir. He said, I would like to withdraw my offer. She said, all right. He said, I would like to say something else if you will let me. She waited. He said, in 1993, when you were not yet born, your grandfather sold 50 acres of that western pasture to Ezra Danforth. He did not want to. He did it because the bank made him. I was 30 years old that year. I was just starting my own operation, and I could have bought those 50 acres from Ezra 6 months later when Ezra tried to flip them. But I did not, because I knew what Ezra had done, and I knew that if I bought those acres, I would be helping him finish what he had started. Buck Hollis said, I did not buy them. Ezra held them until he died. Cyrus has them now. They are in the northeast corner of my property, along the fence line I share with your family. I have looked at those 50 acres every day for 32 years, and I have never once run cattle on them, because they were not mine to run cattle on. He said, I do not know why I am telling you this. Della said, I think you do. He said, maybe I do. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, I am not going to lowball you again, Miss Fales. If you ever want to sell cattle at a fair market price, I am a buyer. If you ever want to swap hay for pasture, I have hay. And if you ever get tired of Cyrus Danforth, you come see me, because I have wanted to buy those 50 acres back for your family for 32 years, and I have never had a reason to try until now. Della looked at him. She said, Mr. Hollis. He said, yes. She said, was it you who opened my gate in January? Buck Hollis went very still. He said, no, Miss Fales, it was not. She said, do you know who it was? He said, I know who it might have been. Would you tell me? I would tell you when it will matter. It will not matter this year. It might matter next year if there is a next year. Della said, there is a next year, Mr. Hollis. He said, then I will tell you next year. He got in the truck. He drove away. Della stood by the hose bib for a long time. Then she went inside. She wrote in her notebook, August 30th, Buck Hollis. First real conversation. He is not the enemy. He may not have ever been. There's another name coming. He will tell me next year. She underlined next year. She closed the notebook. The second winter came harder than the first. It snowed twice in November, 3 times in December, and once in early January, and by the middle of January, Della had gone through more hay than she had planned, and she had to buy a load from a farmer named Amos Kessler in Trigg County at $9 a bale, which was more than she wanted to pay, but less than she had feared. Otis Bell at the feed store called her the morning she was leaving to pick up the hay. He said, Della. She said, yes, Mr. Bell. He said, Amos Kessler is a good man. Your grandfather bought hay from him in 1988 and again in 93. He gave your grandfather a fair price both times. If he says $9, it is $9, and it will be good hay. She said, thank you, Mr. Bell. He said, one more thing, Della. She said, yes. He said, Aunt Hetty is not well. Della stopped. She said, Mr. Bell. He said, Doc Bennett saw her yesterday. She has slowed down. She is 92 years old, and she has slowed down, and she is not telling anyone. I thought you should know before you go up to Trigg County. Della said, how much has she slowed down? Otis Bell said, enough that Doc Bennett stopped by my store on the way home and asked me to tell you. And, you know, Doc Bennett does not ask people to do things unless he thinks they matter. Della said, thank you, Mr. Bell. She hung up. She drove to Aunt Hetty's before she drove to Trigg County. Aunt Hetty was on the porch in a wool coat with 2 mugs of coffee. Della sat down. She did not say anything about what Otis had told her. She said, Aunt Hetty. Aunt Hetty said, yes, honey. She said, I am going up to Amos Kessler's for hay this afternoon. Aunt Hetty said, that is a good idea. Della said, would you come with me? Aunt Hetty said, no, honey, not today. Della said, why not? Aunt Hetty looked at her. She said, because I am tired today, Della, and I am going to sit on this porch, and I am going to drink my coffee, and then I am going to go inside, and I am going to make myself some soup for lunch, and I am going to take a nap, and you are going to drive up to Trigg County, and you are going to bring back a good load of hay, and you are going to come and see me tomorrow morning at 9, and we are going to sit on this porch again. Della said, Aunt Hetty. Aunt Hetty said, yes. Della said, are you all right? Aunt Hetty said, I am 92 years old, honey. Nobody who is 92 years old is all right in the sense that a healthy person means the word. But I am here, and I have my mind, and I have my coffee, and I have you, and that is more than a lot of 92-year-old women get. So yes, I am all right. Della said, I will come at 9 tomorrow. Aunt Hetty said, I know you will. Della drove to Trigg County. She loaded the hay. She drove home. She did not sleep well that night. At 9 the next morning, she drove to Aunt Hetty's. The house was quiet. There was no coffee on the porch. Della walked up the steps. She knocked once. Nobody answered. She opened the door. Aunt Hetty was in her armchair in the front room, in her wool coat with a knit blanket across her knees. She had a book in her lap. Her eyes were closed. She had died in her sleep sometime between 6:30 and 8 in the morning of the same slow heart trouble her grandmother Ida had died of, and her grandfather Wendell had died of, and most of her family before her quietly in a chair with something they loved still in their hands. Della sat down on the floor beside the chair. She did not touch her. She did not cry. She just sat. She was there when Doc Bennett arrived at 9:47. She was there when Otis Bell arrived at 10:05. She was there when the funeral director came at 11. She helped them lift Aunt Hetty into the van herself. She had known she would be helping to lift her since the first time she had sat on the porch with her the previous spring, and she had promised herself without saying it out loud that when the day came, she would not let strangers do it alone. That was in January. The funeral was on the 4th of February. The whole county came. Buck Hollis was there in a black suit that did not fit him quite right. Cyrus Danforth was there in a gray one that did. Otis Bell wore the same canvas apron he always wore over a button-down shirt because Otis Bell did not own a suit. Doc Bennett wore his father's suit from 1982, and Rufus Combs, who Della did not know well yet, but who had been a friend of Aunt Hetty's for 40 years, wore a black corduroy jacket over a white shirt. Aunt Hetty was buried in the family plot at Green Hill Cemetery next to Roy Boone, who had been in the ground for 57 years and had, according to the stone, finally been rejoined. After the burial back at Aunt Hetty's house, Della found a small package on the kitchen table. It was wrapped in brown paper. It was tied with kitchen string. There was a note on top. Della, if you are reading this, then I have gone. In the walnut trunk in the attic of your house, there is one more thing. Your grandfather asked me not to give it to you until you had lost something you could not get back. I promised him I would keep my word. I have kept it. Now go find it. Hetty Boone, October 2024. Della read the note twice. She drove home. She climbed to the attic. The walnut trunk sat where it had always sat, against the north wall, under a pile of quilts that had belonged to her great-grandmother. Della moved the quilts. She opened the trunk. Inside, on top of a folded uniform coat that had belonged to a Fales who had come home from World War II, there was a small leather journal. It was not a notebook. It was smaller. It had a black cover with a gold border worn thin at the edges. Della opened it. The first page said, Journal of Ida Marie Boone Fales, started April 1993, for no one but myself, or perhaps for whichever grandchild is going to inherit this ground when I am gone. Della sat down on the attic floor. She read. The journal was not long. It was 52 pages in her grandmother's small, careful handwriting. Most of it was ordinary. Weather notes, recipes, a short entry about a mockingbird that had built a nest in the porch column in 1997 and come back every year for 8 years. But on page 19, dated March 15th, 1993, Della found an entry that stopped her. It said, Wendell sold 50 acres to Ezra Danforth today. He came home and did not eat for 2 days. He would not tell me the price, but he told me that Ezra had promised him in writing that the acres would be held for our family for 10 years and could be repurchased at the original price plus fair interest. He told me not to tell anyone. He said the promise would not be worth the paper it was written on, but he wanted to believe in it anyway. I saw him sign, and I know a man's face when he has been cheated. I.F. Della turned the page. There was another entry dated August of 1993. Ezra Danforth flipped the 50 acres today for $4,200 an acre. He had bought them from Wendell for $1,200. The buyer backed out at the last minute. That is how we know. But by then, the 10-year hold had already been broken. Ezra owed us nothing legally. He owed us everything morally. Wendell wanted to sue. I told him no. I told him a lawsuit would eat the farm faster than Ezra could have. He agreed. He did not eat that night either. IF. Della kept reading. There were 4 more entries about the Danforths over the next 20 years. The last one was dated April 4th, 1999. It said, Ezra Danforth's son, Cyrus, came to see me today. Wendell was in the barn. Cyrus asked me if we would consider a friendly buyback of the 50 acres at $4,800 an acre. That is 4 times what his father paid us. I told him no. I told him a friendly buyback is what a man offers when he wants to close a wound cheaply. I told him that if his father had wanted to be friendly, he could have honored the original agreement. Cyrus did not answer. He said he would come back. He never has. But he will. IF. Della closed the journal. She sat on the attic floor for a long time. Then she stood up. She carried the journal downstairs. She put it in the top drawer of the desk in the front room where her grandfather's 40 notebooks sat in 2 neat stacks. She wrote that night in her own notebook. February 8th, Ida Fales Journal, 50 acres, Ezra Danforth, Broken Promise, 1993. Cyrus knew about it. Cyrus watched his father do it, and now Cyrus is finishing what Ezra started. She underlined the last sentence. She did not sleep well that night either, but she did not sleep for a different reason. She was thinking. The following Thursday, Della drove into Princeton. She parked in front of First Kentucky Bank. She walked in. She asked to see Mr. Danforth. Cyrus Danforth came out of his office after 4 minutes, wearing a navy suit and a red tie. He shook her hand. He said, Della. She said, Mr. Danforth. He said, come on back. They sat in his office. He said, how are you doing this winter? She said, the winter is going all right. He said, I was very sorry to hear about your Aunt Hetty. She said, thank you. He said she was a fine woman. She was at my father's funeral, you know, in 2005. She came even though she and my father had not exchanged a civil word in 12 years. She came because that was who she was. Della said, Mr. Danforth. He said, yes. She said, I want to ask you a question. I do not want you to answer today. I want you to think about it, and then I want you to answer whenever you are ready. It can be a week, it can be a month, it can be 6 months. He said, all right. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She took out a photocopy of 1 page. She set it on his desk. It was page 19 of her grandmother's journal. The entry from March 15th, 1993. Cyrus Danforth picked it up. He read it. He set it down. His face did not move, but his hand did. He put his coffee cup down. He did not pick it up again. Della said, my question is not whether your father cheated my grandfather. I already know he did. My grandmother wrote it down 32 years ago, and I have found 5 other pages that say the same thing in different ways over the next 20 years. She said, my question is this. She looked at him. She said, Mr. Danforth, are you finishing what your father started, or are you starting something you can be proud of yourself? Cyrus Danforth did not answer. He sat very still. Della said, I do not need an answer today. She stood up. She said, thank you for your time. She walked out. She drove home. She did not tell anyone what she had done. She did not tell Buck Hollis. She did not tell Otis Bell. She did not tell Doc Bennett. She did not especially tell Rufus Combs, who had started coming over for coffee on Saturday mornings, and who Della had begun to understand was going to become something more than a neighbor over the course of the coming spring. She just waited. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the Fales place from First Kentucky Bank of Caldwell County. It was on Cyrus Danforth's personal stationery. It said, "Dear Miss Fales, I have thought about your question. I would like to answer it in 2 parts. First, I would like to extend the current farm operating account terms for an additional 6 months with no fees and no adjustment to the rate. Second, I would like to inform you that the bank is prepared to release at your convenience the deed to the 50 acres of the western pasture that my father purchased from your grandfather in March of 1993. The transfer would be at no cost to you. The paperwork can be prepared this week. Please contact my office at your convenience. I am not asking you to forgive me for what my father did. I am asking you to accept that I would rather be the man who returned the ground than the man who kept it. Sincerely, Cyrus Danforth." Della read the letter 3 times. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked out the window toward the western pasture where the fence line ran along a strip of ground that had not in her memory belonged to her family. She stood up. She got her coat. She drove to Cyrus Danforth's office. She asked to see him. He came out. She said, "Mr. Danforth?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to accept your offer, but I would like to pay for the 50 acres. He said, "Miss Fales." She said, "I would like to pay $1,200 an acre, which is what your father paid my grandfather in 1993, $60,000. I do not have it today. I will have it by the end of the calendar year from the Louisville beef sales and 1 more timber cut on the woodlot I did not cut last spring." Cyrus Danforth said, "Della, I am offering the ground free." She said, "I know." She said, "But if I take it free, then I am accepting an apology, and I am not the one your father wronged. My grandfather is, my grandmother is, my great-aunt is, and they are all in the ground, so I cannot accept an apology on their behalf. I can only pay a fair price and take back what should have stayed in this family. That is different." Cyrus Danforth looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Della." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You are the most difficult person I have ever tried to give a gift to." She said, "I know." He said, "All right, $1,200 an acre by the end of the calendar year, and I will hold the deed at this bank free of interest or fees until you can pay." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Danforth." She walked out. She drove home. The drought came in the 4th year. By that point, Della had 63 head of cattle on the ground. She had 18 calves from the previous spring, 17 the year before that, and 14 the year before that. She had lost over 4 years a total of 6 cows to age and 1 to a broken leg in an ice storm, but she had lost none to disease, none to bad calving, and none to poor pasture. The herd was by any measure doing well. By the end of April of the 4th year, the pastures across Caldwell County were already going brown. By the end of May, the National Weather Service had declared a level 2 drought. By the end of June, it was a level 3. By the end of July, 3 ranches in the county had begun to dump cattle at the stockyard for prices Della had not seen since she was in high school. Buck Hollis was one of them. Buck Hollis lost 40 head that summer, not to dumping, to the pasture. His 300 head could not be sustained on the pasture he had, and he had to buy hay at prices that broke his margins, and he had to sell 40 of his best animals in July at prices that broke his heart. He drove past the Fales place one afternoon in late July. He slowed down. He stopped. He looked over the fence line. Della's pastures were still green, not perfect green, not April green, but green. The springs Wendell Fales had marked in Notebook 17 and Notebook 22, the springs Della had cleared out and lined with stone in the first spring of her return, the springs Buck Hollis had known about for 30 years and had assumed had gone dry, were still flowing. The cover crops Aunt Hetty had recommended in the first winter, the mix of native grasses Della had overseeded, 3 years running the deep-rooted forbs that had come up in patches wherever the ground had been overgrazed for 3 generations, were all holding. The ground was holding because Wendell Fales had known how to read it, because Della had believed him. Buck Hollis sat in his truck at the fence line for 20 minutes. Then he drove home. He came back the following Sunday alone in a clean shirt without a hat. He knocked on Della's door. She opened it. He said, "Miss Fales." She said, "Mr. Hollis." He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "Would you like to come inside?" He said, "Yes." They sat in the kitchen. She poured him a cup of coffee. He said, "Della." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "In January of your first winter, one of my nephews opened your north gate. I did not know it at the time. I found out about it in April of the following year, after your Aunt Hetty told me about the boot prints at a funeral I did not know she would say a word to me at. I asked my nephew directly. He admitted it. I fired him from my operation. He has been in Tennessee since. His name is Bo Pratt. He was 35 years old when he did it. He is 38 now, and he sends me a letter once a year around Christmas asking me to forgive him. I have not written back, but I have thought about writing back this year, because I have watched what you have done with this ground for 4 years, and I have started to think that the reason he did what he did was because he was afraid of what would happen if you were right. He said he was afraid. I was proud, and Cyrus Danforth was greedy, and none of us should have been, and most of us have now come around. Della said, "Mr. Hollis." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would like to buy hay from you this winter." He said, "You do not need to buy hay from me. You are going to have hay to sell this fall. I am the one who needs to buy hay this year." She said, "Then I will sell it to you at fair market." He said, "That is very generous." She said, "It is not generous. My grandfather sold hay to your father in 1988 at fair market. He wrote about it in Notebook 29. He said the Hollis family had never asked for a discount and had never taken one, and that was the reason he was going to keep selling to them for the rest of his life. I am going to keep selling to you for the same reason." Buck Hollis looked at his coffee. He said, "Della." She said, "Yes." He said, "Your grandfather was the best cattleman in this county for 43 years, and he could not get any of us to listen to him. You have gotten all of us to listen in 4. She said, "That is because he did the reading and I did the finishing. It only looks like 4. It is really 47. Buck Hollis nodded. He said 47. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down. He said, "I will take 50 bales this month." She said, "Fair market." He said, "Fair market." He walked out. He drove home. Rufus Combs married Della the following spring. He had asked her once on a Saturday morning in October of the previous year on the front porch of her own house with a fresh pot of coffee between them and a herd of 91 cattle on the pasture behind them. He was 48 years old, a widower of 2 years, and a man Aunt Hetty had once said in the last year of her life was the only man in Caldwell County who understood the difference between owning a farm and being married to a woman who owned a farm. Della had said yes. They were married in the front pasture on the first Saturday of May, under the walnut tree that Wendell Fales had planted in 1971, the year Wendell had started the first notebook, and the year, according to the notebook, he had started thinking about the granddaughter he did not yet have. Buck Hollis walked her down the aisle at Della's request. She said on the morning of the wedding that she had asked him because her father lived in Louisville and her father had never learned to read the ground, and because Buck Hollis had, and because Aunt Hetty had believed at the end that a wedding was a good place to close a wound. Buck Hollis had cried quietly at the altar. Nobody had mentioned it. 6 years after the drought, on a spring morning, in the 11th year of her return, Della Fales Combs walked out of her kitchen at 5:30 in the morning with her 3-year-old daughter, Hetty, balanced on her hip. The pasture was full of light. There were 138 head of cattle on the ground. Captain, now 14 years old, was walking slowly at the head of the herd, the way he had walked for 11 years, with a slight limp in the left front leg from a fence he had run into in year 3, and a coat still glossy, despite his age, because Della and Rufus and Elias Boone, who had grown up to run the second Fales operation on the property Buck Hollis had sold back to the family the year after the drought, had been feeding the herd the same mineral Otis Bell's father had been mixing for the Fales family since 1958. Della set Hetty down on the porch rail. Hetty said, "Mama." Della said, "Yes, baby." Hetty said, "How does the ground remember?" Della smiled. She looked out over the pasture. She looked at the walnut tree. She looked at the spring still running that Wendell Fales had marked 47 years earlier. She said, "The ground remembers because someone kept looking, honey. That is all it is. Somebody looked, and then somebody else looked, and then somebody else." On the kitchen wall behind her in a wooden frame, she had made herself hung 3 notebooks under glass. The first was Notebook Number 1, Wendell Fales March, 1971. The second was Aunt Hetty's small, black leather journal, started April 1993, closed October 2024. The third was Della's own notebook. It was open to a fresh page. The page had a date at the top in her own hand from the previous evening. Under the date, she had written one line: "The ground remembers. Wendell Fales, 1978. Hetty Boone, 2015. Della Fales, ongoing." Hetty said, "Ongoing." Della said, "Ongoing." She kissed her daughter's hair. She lifted her back onto her hip. She walked down the porch steps into the pasture. Behind them, the sun came up over Caldwell County, Kentucky, and 138 head of cattle moved together across 450 acres of ground that had been in the same family for 4 generations and would be for as long as somebody was willing to look in the same family for 4 more. The land keeps ledgers longer than we do, but sometimes if a family is lucky, and if a girl comes home when nobody expects her, and if a great aunt of 91 years drinks 2 mugs of coffee on a porch on a spring afternoon, and if a grandfather 30 years dead has left 40 notebooks in a roll-top desk with a key hidden in a jewelry box, and if a young woman is willing to sit on a hay bale at 4 in the morning in a snowstorm and cry once and then get up, the land does not have to wait alone. The ground remembers. But so in the end, do we